The letter from my aunt arrived on a Tuesday. I know because the radiator was working, it only worked on Tuesdays, and I remember the sound of it knocking behind the wall while my mother read the words aloud, slowly, like she was translating from a language she half knew. Lyudmila had been in Sofia 3 years by then. Her letters listed what she had: a room, a stipend, a coat that was almost the right size. They never listed what the room cost her. 40 years later, I found that first letter in a notebook she left me. By then I knew what she'd withheld. The state had given her everything a girl from our village could want: the education, the title, the briefcase, the address. And in return it had asked quietly and only once, for the one thing she never wrote down. My earliest clear memory is not of a person, but of a sound. The steady rhythmic click of my mother's Singer sewing machine. It was the winter of 1956, and I was 4. The light came from a single bulb hanging from a cord, and it pooled on the wood of the table, on her hands, on the dark fabric she fed under the needle. Outside, the village of Brestovica was black and silent. Inside, that sound was the heartbeat of our house. My father was a tobacco farmer. My mother took in mending. I was their second daughter. Vesela Stancheva, born 1952. That was the world before. Our world was measured in decars and mules, not in politics. My grandfather Georgi owned 12 decars of land and 2 strong mules. In the village, that meant something. It meant he was a man who could look another man in the eye. But by the time I was aware of anything, it also meant something else. It meant his name was on a list somewhere. I didn't know that word kulak, not then. I only knew the way my father's shoulders would tighten when the village committee men passed our gate. Not an enemy. Not yet. Just a hesitation in a room. And then there was Lyudmila, my father's younger sister. She was 11 years older than me, born in 1941. To me, she was not quite a sister, not quite a mother. She was the family's great beauty, yes, with hair the color of wheat and a way of holding herself that seemed to dismiss the dust of the village street. But more than that, she was our great puzzle. She had read every book in the village schoolhouse. She once corrected the teacher's long division on the blackboard calmly, without a trace of embarrassment. She existed at a different altitude. The rest of us were rooted in the soil, in the smell of cured tobacco and turned earth. Lyudmila seemed to be listening for a signal from somewhere else. That memory from 1956. I am on the floor by the stove. My grandmother is shelling beans into a bowl, the talk of each bean a counter rhythm to the sewing machine. Lyudmila is 15. She is sitting by the window, a geography textbook open on her knees, reading aloud about the Rhodope Mountains. I couldn't follow the words. I watched her face. The light from the oil lamp was on her cheek, and her face was absolutely still. Completely absorbed, there was a hunger in it, a kind of pointing. I understood then, in a way a child understands things without words, that people were different. Some people were like our house, solid and facing the road. And some people were like Lyudmila, a compass needle trembling, aimed at the future the rest of us couldn't see. That was the world before it hardened. Politics was something that happened on the bulletin board in the square. New notices went up with red letterhead. The men would gather, read them in silence, and walk away. My grandfather would spit quietly into the dirt by the fence after he came back from reading one. I didn't know what they said. I knew the tone. It was the same tone as a teacher's voice when he stopped calling Lyudmila to the blackboard, even though she always knew the answer. A withholding, a new kind of silence that was starting to form around certain things, around certain people, around our house. The village closed in around us, season by season, but Lyudmila kept reading. She finished secondary school in Plovdiv, coming home on weekends with city dust on her shoes and new phrases in her mouth. She talked about physics, about calculus, languages I did not speak. My father was proud and afraid in equal measure, a feeling that sat on him like a heavy coat. We were a family with a name on a list, and we had produced this girl who shone like a polished coin. It felt less like pride and more like a risk we were all taking. We just didn't know the terms yet. I think I knew, even then, that Lyudmila was our family's transaction with the new world. My grandfather's mules and tecares were the past, and they were a liability. Lyudmila's mind was the future, and it was an asset. But assets belonged to the state. I didn't think it in those words. I felt it as a chill, a draft that came under the door when we all sat quiet after supper. The world before was ending, and the mechanism of its end arrived at our door one autumn afternoon, not with a bang, but with the polite click of a bicycle kickstand. I remember the autumn of 1958 by the sound of a bicycle bell. It was a Sunday, the air sharp with the smell of turned earth from the fields. We were not expecting visitors. My aunt Lyudmila was home from the secondary school in Plovdiv. She was 17, and she moved through the house with a kind of contained electricity like a storm waiting to happen. I was 6, and I watched her from the doorway of the kitchen where my mother was rolling dough. When the bell rang, Lyudmila went perfectly still. She looked at her father, my uncle Stoyan, and he looked back. No one moved until the second ring. He was a young man, the teacher, Comrade Petrov. He wore a dark suit that was too heavy for the season, and he carried a leather satchel. He accepted a glass of water at our table, the good ceramic jug between us. I was told to sit quietly in the corner. He did not look at me. He looked at Lyudmila and then at her parents, and he placed a single sheet of paper on the tablecloth. He said she had scored the highest in the district, a national aptitude examination. He said the words with a formality that made the air in the room feel thinner. The state was offering her a place. The Technical University in Sofia, civil engineering. A full scholarship, a dormitory room, a stipend of 38 leva each month. He laid it out like a blueprint. This is the future we have drawn for your daughter. The silence that followed was a physical thing. It had weight. My uncle Stoyan stared at his hands. I know now he was calculating, but not just the loss of her hands in the fields or the pride of it. He was calculating risk. Our grandfather Georgi, with his 12 decares and his 2 mules, was a name on a list in the village committee office. A family like ours did not send a daughter to Sofia to be remade by the state without considering what the state might ask for in return. The cost was not in leva. The cost was in visibility. I watched Lyudmila's face. She had not taken her eyes off that piece of paper. Her expression was not joy, it was recognition, as if someone had finally read aloud a sentence she had written inside her own head years before. Comrade Petrov was still talking about the honor, about the contribution to the building of socialism, but I don't think she heard him anymore. And then, before Stoyan could draw a breath to speak, before he could weigh the risks aloud and make them real, she said it. Yes, one word. Her voice was flat, absolute. It cut across the room and sealed the silence shut. I remember the exact pitch of it. It wasn't loud, but it left no space for anything else. It was the first time I ever saw her act without calculation, perhaps the last. In that single word was a lifetime of waiting, of correcting sums on a blackboard, of reading every book in the village schoolhouse. It was pure instinct, a bird leaving a branch. She did not look at her mother. She looked only at her father, and her yes was not a request. It was a fact she was presenting to him. Comrade Petrov seemed almost relieved. He stood, shook Stoyan's hand, which was offered slowly, as if it were not quite attached to him. There were papers to sign, he said. He would bring them. And then he was gone, the sound of his bicycle wheels on the gravel fading away. No one spoke. My mother went back to her dough. Stoyan sat back down at the table, looking at the space where the paper had been. Lyudmila walked outside. I followed her at a distance. She stood in the yard, her arms wrapped around herself, looking not toward Plovdiv but north, toward Sofia, a place she knew only from a map in a school book. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. She just stood there, and I understood, even at 6, that she had already left. The person who would ride that train the next year was someone else. The girl who said yes was already gone. That yes was a door closing behind her, for her and for all of us. It was an answer to a question the state had asked, and in answering, she accepted the terms of a conversation that would last the rest of her life. I didn't know that then. I only knew the house felt different. Quieter and at the same time full of a strange humming tension like a wire stretched too tight. She got the papers. She signed them. And just like that, her future was no longer a thing we talked about at this table. It was a file in an office in Sofia. I wonder sometimes what Comrade Petrov thought riding his bicycle back to town. If he saw himself as a benefactor, a talent scout for the new world. Or if he understood that he was just the messenger, delivering both a prize and a sentence. We never saw him again. 38 leva a month. A number I have never forgotten. It was the price they set for her mind. It was more money than our family saw in a season. And it was nothing at all. Because when she packed that cardboard suitcase the next autumn, she wasn't just going to a city. She was going to learn a new language, and the first lesson would be that the words they gave you were never quite your own. I remember the letters. They arrived every 2 weeks, sometimes 3, in envelopes that smelled of the Sofia post office, a scent of damp paper and coal dust. My mother would read them aloud to my father after dinner, her voice low and careful. But I was 7, and I wanted the words for myself. I would wait until she put them away on the high shelf in the cupboard, and then I'd drag a chair over, climb up, and take them down. The paper was so thin, it felt like skin. Lyudmila arrived in Sofia in September of 1959. She wrote about the dormitory on Clement Oritsky Boulevard. 6 iron beds in a room, she said. Gray wool blankets that scratched your chin. A single radiator beneath the window that hissed and grew warm only on Tuesdays and Thursdays, as if the heat were a scheduled ideology. The bathroom was down the hall. If you wanted hot water for washing, you had to be there before 7 in the morning, and even then it was a trickle, a rusty promise. She described it all without complaint. It was just information. A list of facts, like the measurements for a beam. But then she wrote about the other students. This was not a list. This was a map. The girls from Sofia, she said, wore nylon stockings. They had a way of speaking Russian without an accent, as if it were a second skin they had been born inside. The boys from Varna had already read Marx in the original German and mentioned it often while waiting in the canteen queue. And then there were the others, the ones from Plovdiv, from Stara Zagora, from Vidin. They arrived with cardboard suitcases that strained at the seams. They said very little in those first weeks. They watched. Lyudmila was one of the watchers. The engineering courses were one thing: calculus, physics, technical drawing. They made sense to her. There was a right answer. But 3 times a week they were the other classes. Marxist-Leninist theory. Attendance was taken. Participation was noted. She wrote that a girl from her own dormitory room was pulled aside after a seminar. She had failed to correctly identify the stages of historical materialism. She had confused the dialectic. The girl did not come back to lectures for 2 days. When she returned, she sat in the front row and answered every question. Her voice was very loud. We all understood the lesson. It wasn't about the stages of history. It was about the stages of survival. And then, in a letter dated November 1959, she told my mother not to mention certain things anymore. Not to write about Grandfather George's land, and not to write the word mules. I remember standing on that chair, the cold linoleum under my bare feet, reading that sentence over and over. Do not write the word mules. It was such a strange, concrete thing to erase. Those animals were part of the landscape of my childhood. Their smell, their warm breath in the cold barn. And with a stroke of her pen, Lyudmila was asking for them to disappear from the record. From our story, that was when I understood. Going to university in Sofia meant becoming a different person, or pretending to be one. And I was never sure, after that, which one Lyudmila was doing. Was she building a new self, like one of her engineering projects? Or was she just drawing a very clever facade, behind which the girl from the village, the girl who knew about mules, could still live? The letters after that were different. They talked about grades, about the library, about the price of tram tickets. They were letters from a student. They were no longer letters from my aunt. She learned the language they wanted her to speak. She learned to navigate a city where the sidewalks were wider, the buildings taller, and the silence between people had a different texture. A Sofia silence. It wasn't the quiet of our village, which was just space between sounds. This was a silence that was listening. A silence that took notes. She was learning to live inside it, to move without making a sound. And I, a 7-year-old girl in a village house, was learning it too, secondhand, through the thin paper of her letters. I learned that some words have weight, and that the first thing you do in a new world is learn what you must leave behind so you can walk through the door. It worked, of course. She stayed. She passed her exams. The state paid for her food, her bed, her books. 38 leva a month. It sounded like a fortune to us. But even then, I wondered what the real price was, not in leva, in something else, in the things you stopped writing home about. The 38 leva arrived on the 15th of every month. That was the first thing you learned. Not the tensile strength of concrete, not the principles of thermodynamics. The date? The 15th. She kept the budget here, in the back of her thermodynamics book. I have it. 38 leva, 18 for the dormitory bed, 12 for the canteen card, 2 meals a day, no more. That left 8. 8 leva for a month. For soap, for a pair of stockings if a ladder ran, for notebooks, for the tram if the weather was truly impossible. She calculated to the stotinka. The totals are underlined twice. I look at this now and I don't see numbers. I see a mind teaching itself a new kind of discipline, precision under scarcity. It was a form of engineering, too. The cues were the other curriculum. You learned the rhythm of them. The breakfast line at 7 in the morning, still dark in winter, shuffling forward for a piece of grey bread, a scrape of margarine, a glass of tea so weak you could see the bottom of the glass through it. That was a short queue. You were hungry. The long queue was on the 15th. At the finance office. You took a number and you waited, sometimes for an hour, in that corridor that always smelled of floor polish and damp wool. When your number was called, the clerk would slide the brown envelope under the glass. Lyudmila wrote that she always took hers back to her room or to a corner of the library before she opened it. She did not want the Sofia girls, the ones with parents who sent them parcels, to see her count it, to see her check. It wasn't shame, exactly. It was a different kind of privacy. The privacy of having very little. For 2 years, the envelope came, and then in the spring of 1961, she was summoned, not to a professor's office, to the party secretaries. She wrote home about it. I remember the letter came on a Tuesday. My father read it first at the table. He read it twice. Then he passed it to my mother without a word. I was 9. I could feel the silence around the paper. Later, when no one was looking, I took it from the shelf. I stood on the same chair. Her description was careful. She said she'd had a conversation about my future with the secretary, that he'd emphasized the privilege of her state scholarship. That continued support for a student of her promise was naturally tied to active participation in the socialist collective. The Komsomol was mentioned. Application was required. The sensible thing. That's what she called it in the next letter. I have applied to the Komsomol. It is the sensible thing. My father folded that letter and put it in the box with the others. He never spoke about it to me. But I understood. Something had been purchased. The 38 leva a month, the canteen card, the bed in the dormitory on Clement Oritsky. They were not a gift. They were an invoice. And this was the first payment. She learned the language so quickly. A conversation about my future. Not a demand, not an ultimatum, a conversation. She had already learned to translate, to take the hard, plain fact of a threat and turn it into something softer, something administrative, something sensible. I think that was the real moment she left us, not when she got on the train to Sofia. It was when she wrote that sentence. We could no longer speak the same language. The card arrived that March. She sent a photograph of herself taken in a studio in Sofia. She looked older. Her hair was pulled back from her face, no curls. She was not smiling. She was looking at. I showed it to my father. He looked at it for a long time, then handed it back. Your aunt is a student in Sofia, was all he said, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. I didn't know what the Komsomol did. I imagined meetings in large rooms, singing. But I knew from the way the air went out of the room when her letters were read that it was a door, and that once you walked through it, you did not come back the same way. You could not. The stipend continued. The cues continued. The thermodynamics notebook filled with more numbers, more calculations. But the handwriting in the letters changed. It became efficient. She reported her grades, her health, the weather in Sofia. She did not write about the girls who listened to the radio late at night. She did not write about the boy in her mechanics class who argued with the professor about Soviet engineering standards. She wrote about the sensible things, and we here at home, we learned to read the new language. We learned that everything is well meant, do not ask me. We learned that I am busy with my studies meant I cannot say. The 38 leva bought her silence too. Not the silence of not speaking, the silence of speaking only in the new, managed words they had given her. It was the most expensive thing we had ever bought, and we had not even seen the full price. I look at the budget now, at the 8 leva for a whole life for a month, and I wonder what column she put that payment in. What did she call it in her own mind when she wrote her name on that application? Was it a debit? Or was it already by then just the cost of doing business? I don't know. But I know that after March 1961, the letters never again mentioned the taste of the weak tea or the chill of the dormitory radiator. She was learning other things, things that weren't written down in any notebook. The official curriculum was one thing: thermodynamics, structural mechanics, Marxist-Leninist theory. You could pass all those exams. But the real education happened after midnight, in the dormitory rooms, in the silence between the correct answers. That was the curriculum that mattered. Lyudmila wrote about a fourth-year student named Krasimira. She kept the radio under her mattress, not a large one, a small black plastic thing. After midnight, when the corridor monitor had made her last round, Krasimira would pull it out. She tuned it to a frequency that crackled and hissed, and then, if you held your breath, a voice would come through. Radio Free Europe. The volume was so low you had to press your ear to the speaker. You felt the vibration in your jawbone before you heard the words. Lyudmila heard about the Berlin Wall going up in August of 1961 that way, pressed against that plastic grill on a linoleum floor. The official newspapers didn't mention it for 3 days, and when they did, they called it something else. An anti-fascist protective barrier. I remember reading that phrase in Lyudmila's letter and knowing, even as a child, that a thing needs many words to name it when the truth is too simple to say. Then there was Dimitar, a fellow engineering student, 1962. He had an essay. Hand-typed carbon copy so faint you had to squint. It was about the collectivization of agriculture. It asked questions. Not loud, shouting questions, quiet, precise, numerical ones, about yield, about distribution. The kind of questions an engineer might ask about a faulty bridge. It passed from hand to hand. When it came to Lyudmila, she took it to the only place she could be alone, the dormitory bathroom. She locked the door and read it in a single sitting, perched on the edge of the tub. She said the paper smelled of cigarette smoke and mimeograph fluid. She returned it to the person who gave it to her the next day. No comment, just a nod. 2 weeks later, Dimitar stopped coming to lectures. He came back the following semester. He was thinner. His clothes seemed looser. He never raised his hand. He never spoke in the corridors. And he never, not once, looked at the people who had read his essay. He just sat through the lectures, wrote his notes, and left. Whatever they asked him in that time he was away, whatever they showed him or told him, it worked. It erased a part of him that had typed those questions. What Lyudmila learned from Dimitar wasn't that ideas were dangerous. She knew that from her grandfather's mules. She learned something more practical. She learned that the distance between reading a dangerous idea and reporting it to someone in authority. That distance was the exact width of a person's character. And in Sofia, in 1962, she saw that most people's character was narrower than they believed. It was a mathematical discovery, a coefficient of fear. You could calculate with it, so she developed a strategy. I don't think she even named it to herself. She just began to practice it. Strategic invisibility. She was present at every Komsomol meeting. She answered questions in ideology class correctly, but without any extra insight. Never the first answer, never the last. She never expressed an opinion about anything political in a room with more than one other person. It wasn't hiding. It was something more disciplined. She was becoming very, very good at being exactly what they needed her to be so that she could remain exactly what she needed to be. A student, an engineer, a person who had read an essay in a bathroom and said nothing. I admired it when I read her letters, even as a girl, the precision of it, the control. It seemed like a superpower. Later, as an adult, I also found it frightening. Because to get that good at it, you have to watch yourself from the outside. You have to split in two. One part lives, and the other part stands back and audits the performance. And I wonder when, or if, those two parts ever get to speak to each other again. She was building a life inside a very specific set of dimensions. The scholarship, the stipend, the degree, they were the structure. Her silence was the mortar. And watching Dimitar walk back into that lecture hall, a quieter version of himself, taught her the penalty for poor construction. So she built carefully. She didn't know it then, but she was already drafting the plans for everything that came after. The career, the apartment, the choices. It all started here, in these corridors, with these lessons in what not to say and how not to be seen learning it. The degree they would give her was in civil engineering. But the credential she earned, the one that never appeared on any parchment, was in navigation. How to move through a system that could give you everything and take everything, often in the same gesture. She graduated with distinction in the spring of 1963. The state had invested in her. And they would, of course, expect a return on that investment. A graduate's placement wasn't a choice. It was an assignment. Where you were sent told you exactly what they thought of you, of your profile, of your 4 years of careful, calculated presence. Lyudmila got a good placement, a state engineering bureau in Sofia. It meant her record was clean. It meant she had been careful. It meant they believed she was exactly what she had worked so hard to appear to be. I often think about that moment when she opened the letter and read her assignment. Was it relief? Or was it a kind of cold satisfaction that the performance had been convincing? She didn't have long to wonder. The first request for her civic cooperation came just a few months later, not from a teacher, not from a party secretary, from a man in a different kind of office, with a different kind of form to fill out. The summer she graduated, the air in Sofia felt different. It was 1963 and the city was building itself, concrete skeletons rising everywhere. Lyudmila's part in it was already decided. She didn't apply for a job. She received an assignment. A committee somewhere had reviewed her academic record, her Komsomol evaluations, the political profile they had been compiling for her since 1959. They stamped the paper. She was to report to the Institute for Industrial Construction, Directorate 4. A good placement. A clean profile. That was the first lesson of graduation. Your future was a verdict on your past conduct. Her carefulness had paid. The Institute was a cathedral of paper and calculation. A vast open plan room with rows of drafting tables, the smell of ink and lead shavings. I visited her there once years later, and I remember the sound, a low, constant hum of concentration, the scratch of pens, the rustle of vellum. No one spoke above a murmur. You learned to read a room's politics in the slope of a shoulder, in who took their tea break with whom. Lyudmila learned it faster than most. She had been training for it since the dormitory bathroom, since Dimitar disappeared. 3 months in, she was called to a small office on a floor she didn't know. The man introduced himself as Comrade Angelov. No first name. He wore a dark suit that was too heavy for the season. He did not offer her tea. He explained that her position at the institute, her residency permit for Sofia, these were privileges, not rights. They required maintenance, civic cooperation. He used that phrase. He slid a form toward her. It was not a question. It was an instruction. Periodic written reports. The attitudes of colleagues. He said it would be for her own security and for the security of the workplace. He said it was a formality. A way to prove her loyalty was ongoing, not just a line on an old application. I didn't know any of this. Not for 28 years. She carried it alone. He told me in 1991 in our kitchen in Plovdiv, the same one where her father had stared at his hands when the teacher came. We were drinking weak tea from those plain glasses. The file was between us on the table, a thin manila folder stamped with a DS number that was now just a historical curiosity. She said, I wrote 3 reports. They were about nothing. She said she described a man's complaints about the canteen food, the gristle in the stew. She noted another man's lateness to a party meeting. She used the phrase demonstrates a lack of discipline. She told herself it was administrative. She told herself it was harmless. She told herself that, she said, for 28 years. What do you do? That's the question, isn't it? I was a school teacher in Plovdiv by then. I had my own classroom, my own set of silences. I knew the weight of a curriculum you did not write but were responsible for delivering. I knew the look in a parent's eye when they wanted to ask something. They knew I couldn't answer. I had my own small forms to fill out, my own periodic reports on student attendance, on participation in youth ceremonies. Were they the same? No. Were they entirely different? I don't know. I think we all had a form, some version of it. A piece of paper slid across a desk in a room you didn't choose. Some of us signed it, put our names to it in ink. Some of us just lived as if we had. We arranged our lives around the space that piece of paper occupied. We built our apartments, our careers, our family conversations to fit the shape of that silence. Lyudmila signed hers. I never had to face that particular man in that particular suit, but I can't say with any certainty what I would have done. I can only say what I did. And that is a different kind of record. The form was the price of the apartment. That's the terrible arithmetic. The good job, the residency permit, the life in Sofia, it was all a chain of causality that began in that airless office. And once you have the first thing, the apartment, you have to furnish it. You have to make a life that justifies the cost. The apartment was on the 4th floor. I remember the climb, the echo in the stairwell, the smell of wet concrete and boiled laundry that never seemed to fade, even years after the building went up. I visited for the first time in the spring of 1968. Lyudmila had been there a year, sharing with a colleague from the institute. She met me at the door wearing an apron, her hair pinned up, and for a moment I didn't see the deputy section head or the woman with the Sofia residency permit. I saw my aunt smiling in a place of her own. It was 2 rooms and a kitchen the size of a closet. The bathroom had a geyser you had to light with a match, but to me, coming from the village, it was a palace. She showed me everything with a quiet pride. The Balkan tourist sofa, brown corduroy, that unfolded into a bed. The Bulgarian-made television with its rabbit ear antenna wrapped in tinfoil to catch the second channel. The bookshelf. That was the heart of it. Engineering manuals, thick as bricks, with titles like Reinforced Concrete Principles and Static Load Calculations. They stood in a perfect obedient row. And behind the third manual from the left, if you knew to look, there were 3 other books. She showed me once, her voice dropping no lower than a murmur. A Bulgarian samizdat of Animal Farm, the pages typed and retyped so many times the letters were fuzzy. A Hungarian Solzhenitsyn she couldn't read but kept because a friend had given it to her. And the pre-war novel about a landowner which she said had been removed from the library catalogue for historical irrelevance. She never read them when Boyan was home. He was a mechanical engineer, pragmatic, a man who believed in visible structures. Those books were a different kind of architecture, a hidden one. She married Boyan in 1969. He moved into the apartment. It became theirs. A wedding photograph on the sideboard, Lyudmila in a simple white dress, Boyan in a suit that looked borrowed. They looked like what they were, 2 serious people who had found a practical partnership within the same system. He was a good man, I think. He wanted a quiet life. And for a long time, the system gave it to them. She joined the party in 1972. I was 20, in Teachers' College in Plovdiv. She wrote to tell me. The letter was factual. It listed her new responsibilities. It did not explain. I remember holding the paper and feeling a cold clarity settle in my stomach. It was the moment I stopped being surprised by anything Lyudmila did. From then on, I was only surprised by my own continued surprise. Why did I keep expecting her to be the girl from Brestovica? She had left that girl on a train platform in 1959. Her career was a steady upward line on a graph. Section head. Then, in 1978, deputy director of her entire directorate. She had a better briefcase. She attended meetings in buildings with marble lobbies. She learned to speak in that language of managed optimism, where every problem was a challenge and every setback was temporary. I would listen to her on visits and I would think, she is so fluent. And then I would see her eyes when she didn't know I was looking. They were the eyes of a translator, always working. The winter of 1974 was bitter. I was in Sofia for a teaching seminar. I stayed with them. One Tuesday morning, Lyudmila put on her coat, picked up her briefcase and said, "Come with me." There's a queue. No explanation. We walked 3 blocks to the state food shop. A line of 30 people, maybe more, already stretched down the sidewalk. Breath hung in the air like ghosts. No one spoke much. A handwritten sign in the window read, "Bowl, Mo, Red Bowl." Oranges. We stood there for 2 hours. My feet went numb. Lyudmila stood perfectly still, her briefcase at her side. I thought about what was inside it. Engineering drawings, calculations for a factory roof, and soon 4 oranges. When we finally got to the counter, the woman handed them over like they were glass ornaments. Lyudmila placed hers gently into her briefcase next to her papers. She was a deputy section head by then. She had a party card. She still queued for oranges on Tuesday mornings like everyone else. That was the thing about that system. It gave you a title and a briefcase and made you queue anyway, and you were grateful. Because you remembered the alternative. You remembered Brestovica. Walking back, the briefcase seemed heavier. Not from the fruit, from the perfect absurd balance of it all. The prestige and the privation held in the same hand. She had built a life that fit perfectly inside the apartment, inside the job, inside the city they gave her. It was a life of remarkable precision, but precision requires limits. You must know the exact dimensions of the space you are allowed to fill. That was the bargain, I understood later. They measured the space for you. They gave you the blueprint. And if you were smart and careful, and if you didn't look behind the wrong manual on the shelf too often, you could build something inside it that felt like a life. It could even feel like your life, until you reached up and touched the ceiling they had installed. And you realized it wasn't plaster. It was something much harder. And it was exactly as high as they had decided it would be. I remember the exact shade of the paper. It was the color of a faded bruise, that pale yellow-gray of official documents that have been handled too many times. 1976. Lyudmila was nominated for an exchange program in East Germany. For an engineer, it was like being offered a glimpse of the blueprint for a better machine. She told me about it over the telephone, her voice careful, not excited, but with a new tension in it. She had already filled out the forms. A woman's back, straight in a wool blend jacket facing a wide wooden desk. A clerk's hand, a man's, slides a single sheet of paper across the polished surface. The woman's hands, resting in her lap, do not move to take it. The light from a high window falls between them, illuminating the dust motes and the space where a conversation has just ended. The denial came without an explanation. That was how it worked. The absence of a reason was the reason. When I visited Sofia that autumn, she told me over a glass of slivova in her kitchen. She said it was grandfather Georgie. His name, his 12 decades and 2 mules from 1947, still somewhere in a file. A smudge on the family record they could never quite wash out. She said it flatly, as if reading a technical specification for a faulty load-bearing wall. I waited for the anger. It didn't come. What came instead was a week of silence, Boyan told me later. She went to work, she came home, she ate, she slept. She did not speak unless spoken to, and then only in the fewest words required. It wasn't depression, he said. It was calculation, a recalibration. And then the following Monday, she went back to the institute as if nothing had happened. That was when I understood. She had finally finished measuring the room she was in. She had found the ceiling, tapped on it, confirmed it was solid, and had decided to arrange all her furniture, all her movements, to exist just 1 centimeter beneath it. To never, ever touch it. 2 women at a small formica table. One, in her 40s, looks down at her hands wrapped around the glass. The other, younger, watches the side of her face. The window behind them shows a flat white winter sky. A thin curtain, half drawn, cuts the light into a sharp diagonal across the untouched tablecloth. The steam from 2 cups rises and vanishes. 5 years later, in that same kitchen, I asked her. It was 1981 and a Polish trade union was on the news and something reckless entered me. I asked if she had ever wanted to leave. To go west, where her degree might have meant something else entirely. She turned her head and looked at me, not quickly. She took a long moment, as if translating my question from a difficult language. Then she said, I thought about it in 1963. And then I stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it was the most useless thing I could do with my mind. She went back to stirring her tea. The spoon made no sound against the china. That was the whole answer. She had partitioned her own mind. She had declared some thoughts productive and others a waste of resources, and she had enforced the border. People talked, of course, about why she and Boyan had no children. The family whispers in the village, maybe a medical problem. Maybe she was too dedicated to her career. The housing shortage, certainly, a 2-room apartment for 2 professionals, was a privilege, but for a family, a stretch. I repeated these explanations myself for years. A small room in a block apartment. One wall is a drafting table angled toward the window. Engineering drawings are pinned in precise rows. A metal lamp with a green glass shade casts a pool of light over open technical manuals. There is a single utilitarian chair. No crib. No small bed tucked into a corner. The shelves hold slide rules and pens, not toys. It was only much later, after everything, that I saw it differently. I think she looked at the system, this great hungry engine that had educated her, housed her, and asked for her reports in return. She saw how it reached into families, how it asked children to correct their parents' political vocabulary, how it turned dinner table conversations into lessons in loyalty. I think she made another calculation. There were things she would give, her work, her name on party documents, her silence. And there were things she would not. She would not hand over a child. She would not build a person for the system to inhabit. So she built bridges and drainage systems and apartment blocks instead. She left that second bedroom as a study. This was her architecture, not of protest, but of containment. She designed a life that would hold exactly what she was willing to lose and not 1 gram more. I admired it in a terrible way. I still do. It was a kind of brutal personal engineering. But it left everything outside those walls, hope maybe, or a different kind of anger, unbuilt. An older woman's hands, teacher's hands, rest on a wooden table. They are still. A simple wedding band. The skin is pale, the veins prominent. One finger traces a faint grain in the wood, back and forth, a slow, absent rhythm. The focus is shallow, the background a soft blur of bookshelves, and for a long time it worked. Her design held. The ceiling never lowered, the walls never pressed in. She had it measured. Then, in 1989, they turned on the television, and the entire structure of the world outside her apartment began to tremble. And I wondered, sitting in my own living room in Plovdiv, what happens to a person who has spent a lifetime not touching the walls when the walls themselves begin to fall. I was grading papers when the television began to sound different. It was a Thursday evening. The pile of student essays on the coffee table, the red pen in my hand. The state newsreader's voice had a tremor in it, a slight hesitation before certain words. I put the pen down. I remember the exact pattern of the carpet under my feet, a worn patch near the sofa leg. I sat forward. They were broadcasting a meeting of the Central Committee, live. They never broadcast those live. Todor Zhivkov's face filled the screen. He was speaking, but I had seen him on television my entire life, 35 years. His voice was the background noise of adulthood. And then they were voting, a show of hands, to relieve him of his duties. It moved to the man who would replace him, just like that. The broadcast, I sat there for a long time, my hands flat on my knees. I did not feel joy, I did not feel grief, I felt unmoored. As if the room had tilted very slightly, and all the furniture, all the things I knew how to navigate around, had slid an inch to the left. I reached for the telephone. I called Lyudmila in Sofia. The line was busy, a continuous angry tone. I tried again every 20 minutes, for 3 hours. When the ringing finally cut through, her voice was thin, stripped of its usual precision. She said, "Are you watching?" I said yes. There was a silence on the line so complete I could hear the hum of the connection, the sound of her breathing in Sofia. Then she said, "I don't know what I am now." That was all. It is the most honest thing I ever heard her say. What followed was not a revolution, not like in the films they showed later. It was a slow dismantling. Lyudmila reported it to me in our weekly calls, her voice growing flatter each time. The institute was reorganized. Then parts of it were privatized. Then it was reorganized again, a new sign on the old door. Boyan, her husband, was in the first group of engineers let go. He came home one afternoon in the spring of 1990 with a box of his things, a slide rule, a coffee mug, some technical drawings. He was 53. Lyudmila survived 2 rounds of cuts. She learned new words, downsizing, curriculum vitae, market economy. She tried to write a CV. Under affiliation, she put Bulgarian Communist Party 1972-1989. She looked at it for a long time, then took a fresh sheet of paper. She was retired early in 1992. She was 51. They gave her a small pension. 30 years of calculating load-bearing stresses, of signing off on blueprints for factories that were already obsolete, and it ended with a form and a handshake from a man half her age who called the party her previous affiliation, like a club she had quit. I went to Sofia in the spring of 1991. The air itself felt different, sharper, full of a nervous energy. Lyudmila's apartment in the Nadezhda block was the same but quieter. Boyan was out looking for work. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where I had drunk tea as a teenager in awe of her Sofia life. She poured tea now, the same thin kind. Then she went to a drawer and brought out a manila folder. She placed it between us. It had a state security number stamped on the front. They opened some of the files, she said. Her voice was calm, a teacher explaining a difficult equation. I requested mine. She opened the folder. Inside were 3 type reports. Dates, 1964, 1967, 1971. She had told me about them the previous year, in a vague, ashamed rush. Now we were looking at the paper itself. The words were bureaucratic, cold. Observations on a colleague's negative attitude stemming from complaints about delayed materials. Notes on another's lack of discipline for missing a political education seminar. She had signed them with her maiden name. She did not cry. She traced the edge of the folder with one finger. I thought I had been careful enough not to hurt anyone, she said. She looked at me finally. I still think that. I am not sure whether that makes it better or worse. I had no answer for her. I told her I didn't know either. We sat with that silence. It was a different silence than the one on the telephone. That had been the silence of something breaking. This was the silence of the pieces lying on the table between us, and neither of us knowing how or if they could be put back together. She put the folder away. We did not speak of it again that visit. We talked about Boyan's prospects, about the price of bread, about my teaching, normal things. But the room felt different. The life she had built in that apartment, the Balkan tourist sofa, the shelf of engineering manuals, the quiet pride of a woman who had navigated the system, it all seemed like a stage set now. The lights had come up and we could see the scaffolding, the dust. I took the train back to Plovdiv. I looked out the window at the countryside passing, the same fields, the same factories. I kept thinking about her question, whether her carefulness made it better or worse. If she had ruined a life, perhaps the guilt would have been simpler. A clean wound, but she had only traded in small suspicions, minor disloyalties. She had bought her place at the table with the currency they offered, and for 30 years she believed it had cost no one anything. Now she had to live with the receipt. And I had to live with knowing that the woman who showed me what was possible was also the woman who showed me the price. I have been trying to make an accounting for years now, to add up what was given and what was taken and see if the sum is positive or negative. I do not think it works that way. The numbers do not line up that neatly. Lyudmila was the first. The first in our family, in our village line, to go to a university. Before her, education was the village school, then the field, then the factory, if you were lucky. She made a new category. When I was a girl, my parents could point to her and say, "This is what it does." And they meant it. The system built that road. It laid the asphalt from Brestovica to Sofia and put up the signs. It also built the toll booths. The system gave her the stipend, the dormitory bed, the degree that fit in her pocket. It also required the 3 reports. The party card, the erasure of our grandfather's 2 mules from every story she ever told about home. It taught her to measure the ceiling in every room she entered and to stand exactly 2 centimeters beneath it. Both of these things are true. I have sat with them for a decade, these 2 truths, one in each hand. They are different weights. They are different shapes. There is no scale that can balance them. People ask me now, was she a good person? They mean, was she a collaborator, a victim, a beneficiary? She was a person. She was a specific person in a specific place at a specific time, and she made the decisions that specific person could make. I made my own. I did not write reports. I also did not go to university in Sofia. I did not learn to queue for oranges with a party card held just so in my palm, a visible promise. I don't know what I would have done with her life. I only know what I did with mine, and it is not so clean that I can afford to judge. What do I owe her? My own career, in a way. Because she went, teacher training college was a conceivable thing for a second daughter, a possible thing, not an extravagance. That is a debt. What did it cost her? I think it cost her the right to be simple, to have a story that was just one thing, a triumph or a tragedy. She does not get that. Her story is both. It is the scholarship letter and the informant's form on the same desk. She came back to Brestovica in the summer of 1993. For the first time in 30 years, I went with her. The collective farm was gone. The fields were returning to scrub pine and thorn bushes. The schoolhouse door was boarded shut. We walked out to the edge of the village, to where our grandfather Georgie's house had stood. There was nothing left, just the outline of the stones under the grass, like a ghost of a house. Lyudmila stood there for a long time. She didn't cry. She just stood. Then she said, "I thought about those 12 declares every single year. I never told anyone that. Not in Sofia. Not when they ask about her family background. Not when she filled out the forms. She carried the shape of that land, the weight of those 2 mules, in her head for 30 years and never let it out. She asked me to tell you that. She said someone should know the whole of it. This is the whole of it. Or as close as I can get. The gift and the price, the road and the toll. The woman who left and the shape of the land she carried with her. They are the same story. You cannot pull them apart. If you try, the whole thing unravels, and you are left with just threads. Meaningless threads. So I do not have a final sum for you, no verdict, only the accounting itself, which is unfinished. Which will always be unfinished. I owe her my education. She paid for hers with a silence that lasted decades. We are even. We are not even. We are just here, in the aftermath, trying to read the ledger in a language they never taught us.